Welcome to Catholic Perseverance. Presenting Religion, the cause of all wars. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment.
This video will demonstrate that atheism, not religion, is responsible for almost all the mass murders and wars in past history. To do so, we must define atheism. It can be seen as the disbelief, or lack of belief, in the existence of God or gods. In our view, it can be seen as being motivated, not by reason, but by a kind of cowardly, moral escapism. Furthermore, atheism provides a hiding place for those who do not want to acknowledge and repent of their sins. The true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death. The huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, disordered sexual lifestyles, cowardice, greed, envy, murder, theft, adultery, pride, and so on, will not be judged after death. So the Marxist doctrine needs to be revised. It is not religion that is the opium of the masses, but atheism that is the opium of the morally corrupt. If indeed, you want a degenerate lifestyle, God is your worst enemy. Therefore, it is in your interest to rid this universe of God. So in saying this, there are strong attractions to a God-free world. Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who coined the phrase, "God is dead," looked at this form of so-called liberation. Contrary to what modern atheists claim, that just because there is no God, does not mean there can be no morality. Nietzsche insisted that it was very necessary, as God is the source of the moral law. If there is no God, then the ground is swept from under our feet. A godless society becomes ethically groundless, and there is no more appeals to dignity and compassion and all the rest. What confronts us, if we are honest, is the abyss. Each individual is the creator of their own truth, which then becomes what we know as relativism. For example, as many Western societies in the West gradually reject Christianity, situations start to emerge that previously would not have occurred under the moral law of God. Life becomes cheap as atheism manifests itself, as we see with extremely high rates of abortion, and in some places can be done at 9 months, and in most cases it is done just out of convenience. Euthanasia is now legalized in some Western countries where assisted death by medical staff, not the preservation of life, has become a legal option. Without the unmoving moral boundaries of Christianity, we see now disordered sexual activity being pushed as totally normal. This indeed is a Pandora's box that shows no sign of relenting. But without a God's boundaries, who has the ultimate say on what is moral and what isn't? Nietzsche, in a sense, welcomes the abyss. He is, as he puts it, an immoralist. In his view, the abyss enables us, for the first time, to escape guilt. It literally rids us of obligation. It enables us to live beyond good and evil. Morality becomes not something that has been given to us by God, but something we devise for ourselves. The old codes of thou shalt not are now replaced in our secular society by thou wilt. Nietzsche expresses this by stating the deification of passion, splendid animality, and the will to power. Any goal, even one that poses massive hardship or suffering on the human race, is legitimate if we pursue it with energy, resolution, and commitment. The reckless savagery of Nietzsche's rhetoric thrills the minds and hearts of the modern atheist. In summary of this foundation into atheism, we can say that, when an atheist gives elaborate justifications for why God does not exist, and why traditional morality is just an illusion, he is very likely thinking of his sex organs. While the mainstream media and general secular public, through ignorance and total disregard for true history, regularly try to fault religion, especially Christianity and the Catholic Church. Secular writers rarely bring to light the role of atheism in creating wars and mass murder. We often hear how much so-called historical suffering religion has caused, but seldom do we hear the truth of how much overwhelming suffering atheistic thought, put into practice, has brought humanity throughout history. After the atrocities committed by such regimes as inflicted on the Soviet Russian population during its communist era, to the Nazi atrocities of World War II, atheism stands silent with absolutely no accountability. In this segment, we will endeavor to focus on the big crimes perpetrated by atheistic groups and governments. In the past 100 years or so, the most powerful atheistic regimes, namely Communist Russia, Communist China, and Nazi Germany, who have systematically exterminated uncountable amounts of human beings. Here we will see why atheists are content to remain oblivious to history and the horrors perpetrated by atheists. This is the big lie that has been pushed by atheism to cover its tracks regarding this monumental issue. Let us now look at 3 prominent atheists. Joseph Stalin. Born in Georgia in 1878 and died in 1953. In his adult life, he became an avowed atheist. A ruthless paranoid communist dictator of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. This man tops the list of mass murderers in all of history. As dictator, he promoted atheism on steroids, otherwise known as communism, through the education system. He also promoted anti-religious propaganda and hatred with severe discrimination laws. He instigated the creation of the League of Militant Atheists with a barbaric campaign of persecution against Christians whom he pursued relentlessly for around 25 years. Under his regime, all religions including Russian Orthodox, Eastern Catholic, Roman Catholic, Judaism, and Islam were violently oppressed. Priests and monks were tortured and murdered, nuns were raped and murdered, and hundreds of churches and places of worship were desecrated and burned to the ground. This atheistic communist dictator engaged in a reign, unmatched in the annals of history except by other communistic and Nazi dictators who will be mentioned shortly. Apart from mass executions and purges, he ordered large amounts of the population to the gulags in Siberia, who were forced to work in inhospitable conditions until they died from starvation, disease or were executed. He also methodically engineered the famines of Ukraine specifically to exterminate the indigenous Ukrainian population who sought independence in the 1930s. As a result, approximately 7 million people died in what was known as the breadbasket of Europe. The total death count under Joseph Stalin's reign is difficult to estimate, but most historians put the head count to between 40 to 60 million deaths. Mao Zedong. Born in China in 1893 and died in 1976. He ruled as the chairman of the Communist Party from 1949 until his death in 1976. A man who was just as ruthless as Stalin. A true atheist. Some historians classify Mao Zedong as a far greater atheistic mass murderer than Stalin. According to the authoritative Black Book of Communism, an estimated 65 million Chinese died as a result of Mao's repeated, merciless attempts to create a new socialist China. Anyone who got in his way was done away with, by execution, imprisonment or forced famine. The most inhumane example of Mao's contempt for human life came when he ordered the collectivization of China's agriculture under the ironic slogan, "The Great Leap Forward." A deadly combination of lies about grain production, disastrous farming methods, profitable tea plantations, for example, were turned into rice fields, and misdistribution of food produced the worst famine in human history. Deaths from hunger reached more than 50% in some Chinese villages. The total number of dead from 1959 to 1961 was between 30 million and 40 million, the population of California. And yet Mao Zedong remains the most honored figure in the Chinese Communist Party. At one end of historic Tiananmen Square is Mao's mausoleum, visited daily by large, respectful crowds. At the other end of the square is a giant portrait of Mao above the entrance to the Forbidden City, the favorite site of visitors, Chinese and foreign. The total body count for atheistic communism, for 100 years, between 1917 and 2017 would be conservatively speaking, well over 100 million deaths. That's 1 million deaths per year, under an atheistic regime. Adolf Hitler. Born in Braunau, Austria in 1889, and died in 1945. This man is dwarfed by the previous two atheists in number of deaths, but still is highly significant in history as the instigator of a brutal Nazi regime, accountable for an unimaginable amount of human tragedy, suffering and deaths, not to mention the Second World War. You will sometimes hear atheists cry out that Adolf Hitler was a Christian. This is just another part of the big lie. Hitler was born to a practicing Catholic mother, Clara Hitler, and was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. His father was a freethinker and skeptical of the Catholic Church. In 1904, he was confirmed at the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Linz, Austria, where the family lived. In a speech in the early years of his rule, Hitler declared himself not a Catholic, but a German Christian. The German Christians were a Protestant group that supported Nazi ideology. Hitler and the Nazi Party also promoted non-denominational positive Christianity, a movement which rejected most traditional Christian doctrines such as the divinity of Jesus, as well as Jewish elements such as the Old Testament. Hitler's intentions were to eventually eliminate Christianity in Germany, or at least reform it to suit a Nazi outlook. Hitler was a master of propaganda, and he knew he needed to win the hearts and minds of his population, who were largely Christian-based. He realized that he needed to use and subvert religion to enable him to gain power. Through careful manipulation and constant bombardment of Nazi propaganda, he managed to gain the majority's enthusiastic trust in his atheistic vision of the future for Germany. When the Third Reich had been firmly established, and Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he began a brutal campaign of persecution of the Church, imprisoning, torturing, and executing large numbers of Catholic priests and Protestant leaders. Anyone who persists in the ridiculous belief that Hitler was a Christian has only to read some of his published private conversations, first published in 1953 by Farrar, Strauss, and Young. Here are some assorted quotes from the Führer. The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity. Bolshevism is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew. National Socialism and religion cannot exist together. The reason why the ancient world was so pure, light and serene was that it knew nothing of the two great scourges, the pox and Christianity. Christianity is the invention of sick brains. Our epoch will certainly see the end of the disease of Christianity. As the Nuremberg documents clearly reveal, Adolf Hitler embraced the atheist tenets of fellow Hermann Friedrich Nietzsche. It was the Nietzschean belief in the Superman, combined with a ruthless Darwinian view of social politics, that led Hitler to think he could create a German master race. Simply put, he believed that large populations could be genetically improved by the use of selective breeding, which required the elimination of so-called inferior races and blood strains in order to purify Germany's gene pool. Ultimately, this delusion led to the extermination of approximately 6 million Jews and 4 million people the Nazi regime considered inferior, including Christians. When you add all this up, more than 20 million human beings were killed as a direct result of this atheist monster. The list goes on. We should make honorable mentions to the following atheists. Chiang Kai-shek, a communist from China accountable for over 10 million deaths. Vladimir Lenin, a communist from Russia accountable for over 4 million deaths. Pol Pot, a communist from Cambodia accountable for over 2 million deaths. Kim Jong-il, a communist from North Korea accountable for over 2 million deaths. Fidel Castro, a communist from Cuba accountable for 11,000 deaths. The historical evidence is clear. In the long catalogue of human suffering, atheism produced a body count second to none. This is neither speculation, nor biased opinion. It is incontrovertible fact. But what about the Crusades and what about the Inquisition? The atheists cry predictably. Atheists have been whining about these two events for the last 800 years. Let's begin with the Crusades. Atheists and indeed Christian liberals have absorbed the secular allegation that the Crusades illustrate the horrors of religion. Moreover, the allegations are more often than not focused on Christianity and not on Islam. So here we can also see that religion is bad but Christianity is worse. But is this true? Before the rise of Islam in 610 AD, the Middle East was predominantly Christian. There were Jews in Palestine, Zoroastrians in Persia, but most people in areas of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq were Christian lands. The sacred places where Jesus lived, died, and rose again, were Judea, Galilee, Jerusalem and northern Israel. Inspired by Islam's call to jihad, Muhammad's armies conquered Jerusalem and the entire Middle East. They then pushed through northern Africa, east into Asia, and then onto southern parts of Europe. They conquered parts of Italy and Spain and overran the Balkans, and were preparing for an all-encompassing assault on the rest of Europe known then as Christendom. More than 200 years after Islamic armies conquer these regions mentioned, did the Christians finally strike back. Rallied by ruling dynasties in Europe, between the years 1095 and 1272, a series of 9 major crusades took place. The primary objective was to reclaim the Holy Land and defend it against militant Islam. During the sack of the city of Jerusalem, Muslim armies destroyed approximately 300 churches and monasteries and mercilessly persecuted the Christian population. We must also note that both sides were engaging in internal fighting as well. Pope Urban II called on Christians to act militarily, to take back something that was stolen from them, and to defend themselves from being overrun by Muslim hordes. Yes, both sides committed atrocities. But we can see a parallel here with, for example, Second World War. Here was Adolf Hitler and his armies gradually taking over Europe, and what were the Allies to do? Sit, wait, and do nothing. They reacted in defense much the same way the Christians reacted during the Crusades. And yes, not only were atrocities committed by the Germans during this period, but also by the Allies. The bombing of the city of Dresden in Germany by the Western Allies is a good example, and the atrocities committed by the Russian armies on their way to Berlin is another example. This not to downplay what the Germans did, but it sheds light on the fact that neither side was free from these crimes against humanity. That being said, the Crusades were essentially defensive in nature. Though many atheists and anti-Catholic historians like to condemn the wars as comprehensively evil, and thus try to use this as evidence that all religion is basically evil and should be abolished, the real truth is always more complex. The Crusaders claimed to be fighting a war of self-defense against violent Muslim aggression. They claimed to be fighting a just war. Considering the kind of Muslim aggression that still exists today, why is that so hard to believe? The Crusades were important, because they represented a fight for the survival of Europe. Without the efforts of the Crusades, Europe may well have been completely overrun by Muslim hordes. The Inquisition is a handy stick for Catholic bashing to say the least. There is also a huge amount of misinformation about this historical event. Contemporary historians have now established that the horrific images and wildly exaggerated statistics of that period are largely a myth and concocted firstly by the political enemies of Spain, mainly English writers who shaped our American understanding of that event, and later, the political enemies of religion. Firstly, the Inquisition began in the year 1478, more than 500 years ago, when reliable records were not easy to come by. Secondly, it was primarily established as a state institution, not a religious one. Thirdly, its severity has been grossly exaggerated by anti-Catholic bigots whose real agenda is not to provide informed, accurate information, but to use incorrect information primarily for Catholic bashing. According to Henry Carmen, author of The Spanish Inquisition, A Historical Revision, the common picture we have of a quasi-Holocaust perpetrated by the Catholic Church is unquestionably a myth. The typical image of the powerful, torture-mad clerics behind it is an invention of certain 19th-century fundamentalist Christian authors who wanted to discredit the papacy. Two Catholic monarchs of the Catholic Church, Ferdinand II and Isabella I, established the Inquisition as a court of law in order to identify and penalize a group of people known as conversos, Jews and Muslims who pretended to be Christians for political and social gain, but were secretly practicing their own religion. Inquisition trials, according to Carmen, were fairer and more lenient than their secular counterparts throughout Europe. Frequently, The only punishment given was some form of penance, such as fasting. How many people were actually executed during this period? Carmen estimates between 1,500 to 4,000. These deaths occurred over a period of 350 years. Out of these deaths, none were carried out by the church, but by the state. Phony statistics abound. The number of people that were charged is extremely difficult to gauge, but somewhere between 100 and 150,000. The same holds true for the Crusades. An accurate death toll simply does not exist. The total body count, or guess, is around 1 million deaths in 9 main wars, stretched over a period of 177 years. These figures are tragic, but simply don't compare to the death tolls of the atheistic regimes we previously examined. Atheists claim that their philosophy is humane because it centers on humanity and not some make-believe God. But if that's true, why have atheistic dictators tried to destroy so much of humanity? The answer is something atheists don't want to hear and is something they're afraid to admit. And yet it's something so simple, even a child can understand. The solution to this mystery is that, without God, there is no ultimate authority, no judgment, and no moral accountability. Atheists have killed more human beings throughout history because they don't believe in a God who says killing is wrong. They don't believe in a commandment against killing. Just look at our Western societies today as it becomes more atheistic. With legalizing abortion and euthanasia, radical redefinition of the family, high rates of divorce and births out of wedlock, all predicted by Nietzsche. Atheistic thought sees Christian morality as outmoded and should be replaced. In conclusion, religion-inspired killing simply cannot compete with the murders perpetrated by atheist regimes. As Christians, we should not for a moment deny that religion can be a source of self-righteousness, and that this tendency can lead to persecution and violence. In the past, this has indeed been an issue. In the Muslim world, violence in the name of religion is still a serious problem. But for Christians, this is largely and thankfully a thing of the past. The horrors of atheist regimes operated without any of the moral restraints that are the product of religion. Nietzsche saw this coming, stating that the next 2 centuries would be cataclysmic, with wars and violence beyond imagining. The death of God, he said, would be the total eclipse of all values. Since values no longer came from God, they would be made up by man. The atheist regimes, by their actions, confirm the truth of Dostoevsky's dictum. If God is not, everything is permitted. Atheism, not religion, is responsible for the worst mass murders of human history.